Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Pennsylvania State AHPERD Live. This is YouTube Live, season number 4. This year, we are focusing our admin track around the book Learning Transformed by authors Eric Sheninger and Thomas Murray. Speaking of Eric Sheninger and Thomas Murray, Thomas will be joining us here in 2019, December 6th, at our conference down at Spooky Nook in Salunga, Pennsylvania. Can't wait to see everybody there. And Eric, his co-author, is now been signed as our 2020 speaker. So we're looking forward to having both of these guys join us. And you are not going to want to miss either one of them because they are phenomenal. I've seen them both several times and inspired. Each time I see them, I learn something new. Tonight with us, we have from the Lower Moreland School District, Dr. Scott Davidheiser. He is the superintendent at the Lower Moreland School District, and I'll give him a chance to introduce himself. Scott, say hello.
So hello, good evening. As Todd said, my name is Scott Davidheiser, superintendent, Lower Moreland Township School District, and fortunate enough to be on this evening, and certainly fortunate enough in my first year as superintendent in Lower Moreland. So it's an exciting time in Lower Moreland for myself and hopefully many others in the school district. And I was certainly blessed and fortunate enough to become the next superintendent there after a great legacy by Dr. Feely, who had been there for over a dozen years. So by a little bit about my background, I come from Central Bucks School District, where I was the assistant superintendent for secondary education. And formerly, I had been the principal at Central Bucks High School South. My roots are in Phoenixville, where I began as an English teacher in middle and high school, and cut my teeth in administration as an assistant principal at the middle school prior to moving on to Central Bucks. So thank you for having me on this evening.
Thanks, Scott, for being with us. And for those of you that are going to enjoy tonight, we're going to learn a lot from Scott tonight. He'll also be joining us at Spooky Nook in the fall. Jessica Piccone-Cook, one of our co-hosts, usually with us tonight, unfortunately came up ill. A lot of that going around here in the spring, so she won't be joining us tonight. But our favorite co-host, Brian Robinson from Cumberland Valley School District, is with us tonight, and he's going to start off the night and say hello to everyone. Brian?
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to co-pilot with Todd, although he's so good at it, I could probably just autopilot. Scott, it's awesome to have you here, and we're going to jump right into it with a question about culture. Culture is so important in today's schools, and a question for you, maybe a little loaded based on the book that we're reading, conversations that we're having, is would you consider culture more important than the actual content and pedagogy that's being delivered and the way it's delivered in your schools?
Yeah, and I would have to say that they're probably nearly equal in terms of that. With a culture, I define a culture really as just all the shared beliefs and values that all different stakeholder groups bring in, and hopefully shared and equally shared among everyone. So it's in order to have a safe environment to learn, an environment that advocates for kids and for students, one that's welcoming, and one that sets a high value and expectation for learning and growth, and ultimately leads to great achievement. So in order to have that, it certainly is as important, if not more important, than the content itself. We're fortunate enough to hire some of the best teachers to deliver the content and utilize great instructional practices along the way to engage our kids. But that culture of those students walking in and feeling the comfort and feeling the safety and the ability to step outside of their comfort zones at times is equally as important. So culture, in my mind, is highly valued. And culture, if you know anything about culture, it's one of the more difficult things to break at times, and it's also one of the most unbelievable feelings of moving a large organization forward and having a dynamic culture that really puts value of students first, and everyone moving in a very, very similar direction. So my long-winded answer to that is, I would say, as equally, if not more important than content and pedagogy.
Well, that's a great setup to the follow-up question, which is, if culture is toxic, what advice would you have for teachers to overcome that with their students, and then a little bit for principals with the staff?
Yeah, for leadership, it really, in my mind, it falls back to leadership, and leadership is not just that the administrative team; it's the adults. It's all the adults that have welcomed the opportunity to take on the challenge of educating kids and delivering that. So it's everyone coming together and again, you put two people in a room, oftentimes you can't get a consensus, let alone putting a large organization of many people in there. But we have to be able to consent to some broad constructs to what success is and how we're going to deliver that, and very, in a way that advocates for kids and that's welcoming. Now, we always have the ever-present conditions set for learning to occur. And I think those are things that adults can all agree to. And, it's important and really incumbent upon all the adults to set a high level of expectation for that. And that's a challenge that I've found that most teachers, most administrators, most parents, most stakeholder community members, they expect those high level of expectations, and the challenge of trying to meet that on a daily basis is very important and ultimately really rewarding for adults. And if that's moving forward, as a result, you're going to see high levels of engaged learning with kids. So it's really that shared belief in everyone that really sets the stage. It keeps the toxicity really removed from an organization if you can maintain that.
Yeah, I love what you said too about making sure that the adults are happy too, because I've heard the term a long time as a teacher. This is year 24 in education. I hear the term often says, well, what's best for kids, and which is really important. But sometimes, like what I've heard recently, and I can't remember who, I think Tom Murray might have said it, sometimes what's best for adults is what's best for kids. So I love that you're talking about having these adults being part of the culture and making sure that they're comfortable and happy as well.
Absolutely.
So speaking of environmental things, when I talk about, there's a lot of research now about the environment in school, classrooms, like Seth Godin says, we talk about company culture sometimes, and all they want is free food and beanbag chairs. And that's segueing a little bit into the classroom environment. We've been around with these hard student desks for years, sit them in rows. Tom Murray calls it the cemetery effect because it looks like very much like a cemetery. And it's important in schools. But what changes have you seen in your school? What changes are teachers making to those? I mean, I know budgets are limited sometimes, so it's not like you can just go drop, $1 million on new classrooms because everybody wants free food and beanbag chairs. But what kind of changes, or what would you like to see if you haven't seen the changes yet?
Yeah, I think there's two things with that. I mean, I think there's the hardscape, which you're talking about there a little bit with, the flexible models that we're all talking about these days. To me, flexible seating is nothing more than what some have done and educators have continued to do. Throw desks together, create grouping centers, take small groups, move them to different areas. The flexible model of furniture and the mobility of furniture has changed more recently, and it's made it more advantageous to get things around. But ultimately, what we're trying to do day in and day out is take large community-based and break it down to smaller communities. We know learning works much better in smaller base settings. We can deliver and differentiate much better in those types of settings. It allows for better collaboration among learners. So all those things have to exist in order for wellness and for good feeling and understandings of one another, and in order for a lot of bodies to get along with one another throughout the course of an 8-hour day. Mm-hmm. You think about how many students come into a learning center, into a school in any given day, and how unbelievably well on day-to-day basis that schools run themselves. Overall that most schools create a culture that's warm and welcoming. and it's our job to ensure then that the deeper meaning to all of that is met, and some of that is done through that. So currently, we're seeing right now, in the form of programs, it's taking and creating advisory types of centers and learning types of situational things that create wellness, that give voice for kids so that they understand one another. We often lose, sometimes our direction of empathy when we don't necessarily walk in the shoes of others. So I think it's important in those times, and certainly in our social media world that we have and the instant gratification world that exists, to sit back and to really authentically listen to one another, listen to our peers, and advisory types of situations do that. On the harder, hardscape kind of line of what schools are doing, we've started to create a little bit more common areas for some of that more natural socialization just to take place in a school center, where it used to be very fractured. You'd go to this room, you go to this room, you go to that room, and the only time you got to see anybody else was passing in the hallway. Well, we know that isolation doesn't necessarily lend itself to the greatest collaborative and types of efforts that we need. So it's important for us to be able to do some of those types of things. Certainly there's a lot of grant opportunities that have come out of this. Foundations at school districts alone have helped out. And I think there's been more of a reaching into the community and into the partnerships in the business world to try to help offset some of the funding and some of the expenditures that come with some of the changing dynamics of schools from the hardscape kind of place. But I think equally as important, we have to be mindful of how we're really designing our day-to-day operations too. How flexible are our scheduling? Life has to be flexible at times, and sometimes schools become just the opposite and very rigid. And we need to be understanding that life exists, and we need to be mindful of that so that we're valuing wellness with students along the way too.
Do you see this as, if you build it, they will come, or do you force the collaboration? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you have to do some equal balance of that. I think we have to design centers that force that and that type of setting. But I think we also have to be mindful. Most schools have started to move toward the one-to-one. We're in a one-to-one setting in our secondary schools. And that model of collaboration, when you open up the screens and you're moving about, tends to create, again, a more isolationist type of setting. So how do you engage and how do you create more collaborative nature to some of the things that have to get done? So I think we have to be mindful of how we're bringing those types of things together, and what types of groupings. How do we use data to understand what types of groupings that we really need to have? Also, just putting people together into other types of groups isn't for grouping's sake, isn't doing anything unless we understand the value to which, when, why, when, how we're doing it.
Cool. Scott,
Brian?
you mentioned trying to have this sounds strange, but almost schedule or plan for flexibility in the school day. Are you able to expand on that, kind of from a superintendent standpoint? Are you talking about? Well, I guess my question is, what are you talking about? Because that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, and some of the thinking down the road, and we're certainly not there yet in terms of how we're looking. And we're in the midst of a strategic plan development right now, some of which is going to have, in the next few years, us investigating our program and delivery systems and models, and swallowed up in some of that are our schedules at our buildings. So what do we want? Whether the end result of what type of final product do we want? What type of student do we want walking across that graduation stage, and then working backwards from it, and how can we get to that point in time? And is our schedule currently doing that for kids now, or are there other opportunities that we can utilize? How much experiential learning are we including in a student's career as they make their way through secondary experiences? How many partnerships with outside organizations? How much possible online? I do believe there's a nature to which we probably need to be at least exposing students to some type of online course at least one time during their career, if not or along with some type of blended environment to ensure that, you know, we're certainly driving down deep to what their next steps in the post-secondary are going to be. In my school district, we have a large percentage of students moving on to post-secondary experiences to which they're going to be exposed to a number of different online types of situations. So we need to look and evaluate, do we have the flexibility and do we have the expertise right now, or do we need to design better pathways for some of those things to occur with flexibilities? You know, do we have the experience, when I mentioned experiential, I mean, you know, links itself to more of what we would traditionally call the internship types of things, and how, you know, partnerships can exist out there with some of the flexibleness of that. So I think we have schools, and we have my schools are all brick and mortar, and there's a place to come, and where learning exists, where students walk in more ready than ever before. Our challenge is taking a lot of that knowledge and information they already have, and how do we facilitate and have them critically think about things a little bit differently, and how does it link to career pathways and the types of skills that they're going to need down the road for them to be very, very successful. You know, in the internet world that we live in right now, there isn't much information a student can't get on their own. We know the importance of a teacher that exists, and how they exist to be able to craft and mold the minds of those students and the information they have. But it's our job to figure out is how and where we're using teachers best to be able to deliver some of that. Might look a little bit different than when you and I went to school, and probably should look a whole lot different than some of that. But the greatest asset, and I don't think it's ever going to change, is that of the teacher. And research for centuries or for decades has lamented on the fact that you know, they're the most important asset that a student can have. So maintaining that's very important.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you brought up the career piece of that, because we're going to follow up on that a little bit later this evening. Quick plug for another show that Todd did. Todd hosted our high school's executive director and one of our CITs, a whole program about our career pathways programming at Cumberland Valley. So if you're interested, Scott, it's 48 minutes of pure gold. Shifting gears here a little bit, I want to talk about how you and your team communicate with the community. Communication is, of course, really, really critical. Meeting people where they are is getting, seems like it's easier and easier, but also it's harder and harder because we're competing with Netflix and phones and, you know, of course, parent and community members' lives. You know, a great quote is, in the absence of knowledge, people are going to make up their own knowledge or their own story. So, yeah, maybe removing the names to protect the innocent or not. Scott, can you think of a time when the community misunderstood something that was trying to be accomplished by either you or your team, and how you worked on overcoming that misinformation and negativity?
Yeah, I'd say that's probably every year in the life of a superintendent, and that probably centers around taxes and the Act 1 index. And I think really it's the lack of knowledge and understanding centered on Act 1 that community. In my school district, 65% of our stakeholder group has no children coming to our schools. That's 65% of our tax base that have 0 students coming to our schools. Now, whether they had formally or they never did at all, it's still important to recognize that from a revenue standpoint, especially when we have nearly about 89% of our revenue that's coming in through taxable households comes through the residents. So it's important for us to be able to hopefully try to proactively educate. And we did that this year with really getting out in front of our community and really educating them about Act 1, educating them about the issues that lie within our district when it comes to revenue sourcing And when it comes to some of the lack of commercialism that we have within a district, I'm in a very small school district, and 9% of our taxable income revenue comes from commercial property. That means 91% is coming from the households. And when you have 65% of those households of non-children households, there's no tangible product walking in and out of the door every day for those folks. And that's important to really educate them, some of which are on fixed incomes as seniors, and really communicate to them, and dynamically, my business manager and myself really put on some presentations, did some narrative PowerPoints, and then we really proactively sought out those community members. We went out through our tax collector's office, got addresses, literally went old school and sent postcards to all those households, and asked if they'd like to be part of our email list and distribution list so that we could give them information, and also send them updates, our monthly newsletters from our offices and so forth, that could really engage them and have them truly understanding some of the dynamics that a school district has and exists, to which they pay taxes to every year. So that's probably the biggest example that I've learned of this year, really educating and being proactive with regard to that.
Are you finding that the use of social media in those instances is helpful, or is your community not really like connecting to you through Facebook? I know most of the taxpayers are probably on Facebook more than Twitter. Yeah,
some on Facebook, but we surveyed them in the fall, and we sent that out, and overwhelmingly how they wanted to be communicated was through email. We do have Twitter. We do try to go through some of those, but we were finding that the value to that was a little bit more directed toward how we, it's almost a direct mailing. It's an electronic direct mailing that them wanted to see coming into their inboxes. Some of that is a generational thing as well, and we understand that, and we want to try to meet them at the readiness levels to which they want to receive that information. We don't want to make it a challenge. We want it to be something pretty simple for them to do. So it's been important. We did surveys to all of our stakeholder groups in the fall, especially me coming in as a new superintendent. It was helpful for me to learn the culture and norms and ask a lot of questions related to a lot of the things that we're talking here tonight about, and finances and culture and educational opportunities and things like that, all very, very important. And it was important now that we're setting our strategic planning up, and we have a number of those non-child household community members actually sitting on our strategic planning team, giving voice to some of the things that we need to move forward with. So.
Brian, did you have something you wanted to add before we move to the next segment? I sort of talked over you and didn't realize it until I was already through my question.
I was just wondering about the kind of response that you got from those postcards.
Yeah, we currently received 868 email addresses that we received back. Wow. Roughly 4,000 households. So mathematically, not statistically all that relevant. However, it's a start, and we're hoping to build upon some of that as we move forward. So, we're distributing a lot of information, and I think positively that information is making its way across, and we've gotten some real good positive feedback from it, and feeling feeling much more valued and much more understanding. It was important to come in and create a communication plan right away as a new superintendent, and some of that dealt with how we're going to operate on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis with all of our stakeholders and what they can expect from us through communication. And that was really important. We needed to get that off the ground in a hurry. So by October, we had that plan involved, and we've really been sticking with that and evolving through time with some of the things and some of the landscapes. And one of the big challenges will be, as we start through or conclude our strategic planning process, will be that understanding of what that branding means. Do we need a new type of branding, and what's important within the community, and how we're going to really allow that to come out through a branding opportunity as well.
Well, Scott, I want to switch gears a little bit. Recently, like as early as last year, I guess the state came out with career readiness standards and part of Chapter 339, which basically factors into the school building scores now, what kind of career opportunities we're offering kids. And what we learned, I think, at our district, which was really telling to us, I think, like I mentioned it when we were kind of prepping for this, and there's a great book out called What School Could Be by Ted Dintersmith. And in that chapter, in the one chapter, he talks about Eisenhower High, which is a fictitious school that's very much into their test scores and sending kids to college. And he makes a case that schools do a great job preparing kids to write their college essay, but we don't necessarily do a great job preparing them for careers. And so I know there's pathways now that the state has kind of had, and a lot of schools are aligning with that. What kind of things is your school doing in that regard? To get kids ready? And do you agree that we're preparing kids well to write their college essays, but maybe sometimes they're not going back for their sophomore year because they think, oh, I should just go major in philosophy, and they realize the job prospects at $200,000 in debt is kind of a difficult thing to correlate.
Yeah, and I think this is a good initiative that Governor Wolf put in with the Future Ready pieces to it, and it's one of which is a little bit of a cultural readjustment, I think, for a lot of communities, to which there's still a bit of a stigma associated in many of the communities with regard to even just vocational technical types of skill-based types of things. But we know we're moving into a more automated work skill-based opportunities that are going to be driving things. We need people to develop the automation. We need the engineers. We need the skill. We need all sorts of different types of folks within the labor forces. So I think it's a good initiative for us to get students thinking about those things earlier. Not that it's going to change their minds to which their post-secondary opportunities may exist, but it's certainly going to put them, I think, in better situations as they walk across the graduation stage at high school to have a little more direction, to have more time to investigate some of the schools that and to eventually to a school that they may have committed to. And obviously then hopefully a little bit more focused through the 4 years. And we know that dropout rate is fairly high after a freshman year, and has led to a lot of the student debt that we're in, and some of the crisis and what many say the bubble is about ready to burst with regard to that. So, I think it's incumbent upon us as educators to really along with all of the meeting the standards, to which is a heck of a lot of content, but driving in those skill-based ideas and how each of those skills that we're learning through subject-based learning, how it connects and how they connect to occupations, how they connect to the types of situations that students are going to be placed in when they do go into the workforce. And let's face it, the first jobs they take, those companies, those places are going to train them in the way they need to be trained to do what they need to do. However, they're going to need some skills that those companies can work with, whether it's resiliency, whether it's critical thought processes, whether it's a way to be able to collaborate with fellow coworkers, whether it's, having some humility and empathy toward others, and having some of those types of skills that are operational skills that can immediately then be put into use through what it is they're going to be directly trained in. Ultimately going to be important. We shouldn't be setting students up for certainly something that they don't know about. And I think for some time, I think we were just promoting that, to which you go and I've talked that we had it was interesting because we had a career fair for the first time ever in Lower Moreland 2 weeks ago, and I spoke to the students prior to the career fair, and my message is, how are you going to remain relevant? And it was really centered on a lot of skills. What types of skills are you going to be able to acquire, and how are you going to be able to mold yourself, and how flexible are you going to be to remain relevant? Because that idea of go to school, go to college, earn a degree, and land a job for the next 30, 35 years, it's, for the most part, it doesn't exist. too many opportunities for those types of things any longer. And as an adult, you're going to be probably changing your jobs multiple times throughout your career. So how flexible, how motivated are you going to be to upskill and really start to learn other skills even as an adult, and taking on some of those challenges. So it's really inspiring them as being a youth to understand what the future holds for them, and how they're going to have to equip themselves and be ready to be somewhat changeable and flexible.
Do you see that the community is a little bit confused by the idea? Because I know, like, we're all kind of in our 40s, and when we grew up, the definition of success was go to college, or you worked for the guy that went to college, and that is so not the case now. I mean, I had a student 3 years ago, graduated from VOTEC in HVAC, got a job at $70,000 a year straight out of the VOTEC. And he probably wasn't going to have SAT scores to get him into college. Do you find that your community still thinks that, like, the definition of success is that 4-year college?
I think there's still that stigma. I don't know that ultimately they think all of that, but I think there's still a stigma with comparisons in the demographic to some degree that many of the districts in my surrounding area we center on. And I think that people still feel that challenge and that stigma, even though they may know that what we should be doing for our students is somewhat a little bit different. So I think that's going to still take some more time. But it's also getting them to understand the importance to that. And I think that's, this is new. We're really only driving into our second year now with Future Ready. So it's something that we're going to have to keep at the forefront and keep talking to people about, and molding our programs around some of those types of things. How are we going to shape, and not just bringing in a career fair every so often, but it's literally tying the occupation-based learning into some of our core content areas, and understanding what that relationship is to it, and the skills that you're going to need in some of those areas, exposing them to occupations.
So Scott, with all these needed changes in our schools, as the newest lead learner in your district following a 12-year superintendent, how do you create an environment in which your administrators and your staff feel like they can take risks in their work while they're trying to embrace this new paradigm and meet these new needs of our students?
Yeah, and I think it's as leaders, it's always incumbent upon me to keep in front of them at the forefront. I look at them as people of influence. As a leader, you're a person of influence. So it's not necessarily control, it's influence. So how are you taking a large body of people and influencing in them to take their own risks, set a high level of expectation, but take risks in doing that? And again, just like we are with students right now, and how important it is for us to try to meet as many individual needs as we possibly can. The same with our staff. We have to be able to understand their needs and understand how we can cultivate a sense of them taking risks and them learning in some different ways while still meeting the expectations that we have. So the administrative staff's influence is ever more important. So it's empowering them as leaders to take risks, to think outside the box, to generate new ideas, to foster those, to gain voice from others within, and encourage that. And then ultimately for others and for myself to deliver feedback and feedback on what are the strengths that come from that, what are some of the areas that we can improve upon. Because leadership, in my mind, it never takes a day off. You're always there as an influencer. You're there as a person, not a control, but you're there as moving something forward and trying to move it forward every single day. And it's really about self-improvement, continuing the self-improvement needs that each one of us must have. That makes sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Brian, do you want to do the rest of the segment, or do you want to move to Twitter?
Oh, Yeah, sorry about that. I was taking notes and I got off my column. So Scott, and this is a tough question probably for you as the only first year superintendent among the three of us. How do you work with the school board who may be more focused on those test scores, on SPP, on the U.S. News and World Report ranking? How do you work with them to help bring them as those influencers into this era of new challenges?
Yeah, and I think, I'm fortunate in which I have a wonderful board in Lower Moreland. I have to put
Great answer.
but sincerely speaking, they're a board of, when I say simply, they get it. They get it. They understand the challenges that are incumbent upon trying to set a high level of achievement. And obviously, schools are built for high level academic achievement, but it's also for growth. It's getting them to understand what growth means. And from a sense of, do we have healthy students when it comes to from a social and emotional standpoint? What does our PAYS data look like, and how important is that PAYS data, and what programmatic things are we shifting to our students and to our teachers in order to grow in those areas as well? So it's really trying to get them to understand the interpretation of the whole child is essentially what we're trying to do. But it's also the financial health of the district as well. And each board member has his or her strengths, probably mostly through their occupation to which they exist, which their occupation is not school board member. So when you think about governance and you think about financials, it's really educating them about the need to understand the various things of revenue sourcing, of what we have when it comes to costs and cost structures, and how do we budget appropriately, and how do we look long range. One of the key pieces to a strategic plan is being able to eventually tie back every decision you make, every motion that you bring to a school board. Can you tie that back to a strategic plan? And does it somewhere exist within objectives of a strategic plan? Because if it doesn't, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. It should not be part of what it is you do. If you're shooting at the hip every single day, you might get a lot accomplished, but I don't know how many steps forward you're really going to make. You might be putting a fire extinguisher to a lot of fires all day long and staying busy, but the motivation to move forward has to be tied back to that vision. So go back to that first question you both asked me about culture. How do you develop a culture? And a culture is all developed on shared beliefs and values. So that vision, that mission, those objectives, everything you want to do throughout the course of a year or throughout the course of many years is tied back to what are you setting in that strategic plan, and the decisions and the goals that you wanted to get accomplished in that time, and really not stray from that too often. That's important from a standpoint of communication. So teachers, support staff all have an understanding as to what's the goal and how are we going to get there. And there's reminders through communication, but ultimately there's a plan that's been put in place, and that gets communicated out in various different ways, shapes, or forms, whether it's through professional development or whether it's through simple communications or whatnot. So it's taking all that culture and moving and developing that culture around that plan that's so very important, so that you're somewhat laser focused as the leader then, and it brings your board collectively into a centric type of mode and true understanding of what the importance pieces are to it, which are certainly achievement scores when it comes to academics are tend to be most high on the list. But how safe are we as a district? How involved are we as a district when it comes to participation in so many different co and extracurricular types of things? How healthy are we financially? What are we doing in support services world? And where's the technology integration pieces that we've now spent a lot of capital money on? and where's the success with those types of things. So you tie all that back to it. So yeah, you talk about culture. As now I'm talking more and more throughout this program. Brian, I'll go back to your first question. I'd say culture probably trumps it by far over content and pedagogy. So
yeah,
I'll go down to the Morris lane.
I would agree with that for sure. For sure. Yeah. So, well, Scott, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I want to be respectful of your time. So we're going to jump to the last segment and do the Twitter advice segment. And folks, if you've learned as much as we have tonight, I am so pumped to go to your session in the fall and December 6th at Spooky Nook and learn more from you. I've learned so much tonight, and you just seem like one of those guys. I just want to be in your space and absorb what you do and how you do it. So thank you for being with us tonight. And we so appreciate you being here.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it. Look forward to the fall.
So this last segment is called Twitter advice. So the answers we say are roughly in 280 characters or less. A famous principal that Brian and I know one time would probably call this rapid fire. Don't laugh too loud, Brian. That was a fun one. But anyway, so we'll just alternate down the line, and I'll start. So what's one thing that you would say that students or young people need to do to become a great teacher?
Be empathetic.
Nice.
Be humble, and be flexible.
That's awesome. Brian?
All right. What's the most important learning for our students?
Resiliency.
Nice. Who are your favorite educators that you look up to, either on Twitter, on the internet, or through authors that you would advise us to find?
Probably, I mean, Marzano.
Okay.
Sure. Love Linda Darling Hamlin. Love her. A former colleague of mine in Central Bucks. You'll have to look her up. Lindsay Smith. She's a supervisor for instructional technology in Central Bucks School District. Unbelievable, creative, and just a dynamic tech integrator in the world of understanding theory and putting it into practice.
I think I follow her on Twitter. I think I'm familiar with her.
Yeah, you may have.
She's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
All right, Scott, second to last one here. What is the best advice you have ever gotten that you remember?
My former superintendent, and this comes out of the Covey habits. So it was, seek first, understand before being understood. And it's all listening, don't hear, listen.
That's awesome. Well, Scott, one day we will all wrap up our career and walk out of our offices or classrooms for the final time. What word or phrase would you want to be remembered by when you walk out for the final time?
Well, I hope my wife and daughter say I'm the best version of a father and a husband.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Scott, thanks so much. On behalf of Brian, thank you also for co-hosting tonight and being with us. And we look forward to seeing you in the fall, and we appreciate your time tonight.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate meeting you both, and look forward to seeing you in the fall as well.
Thanks.